Paul, welcome to Talk Satellite. We're delighted to have you join us. Today.
Sure. I'm glad to be here. I've got wonderful weather out. I'm here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is in the United States, not in Mexico. And I can see 11,000 foot tall mountains out my window, and it's going to be probably about 70 degrees here. Now, I'm not sure about the UK, but I'm enjoying life at the moment.
Paul, you have a long history of operating at a high advisory level for space defence. Please, can you provide us background on your work and some of those organisations that have benefit from your expertise?
Okay, yes, gladly. First of all, I skipped my senior year of high school and senior year of college and received 3 degrees at the age of 22. And that's important because soon after, I started working at the Pentagon in space warfare. And the consequence of that is I was always the youngest person in the room at the time. Everyone was 10, 20 years older than me. And now I'm just about 74 years old. Most of the people I work with, if not all, have retired, passed on, whatever. So I'm kind of the last of the original space warfighters from the 1970s. And there's actually been 11 space wars since the 1960s. So I've had like 86 different security clearances over my lifetime. They all timed out 12 years ago when I retired. So I'm not going to talk anything classified, though I sort of know where the skeletons are buried, so to speak. So I've always never really worked directly with the United States government. I've worked with think tanks, nonprofit think tanks that consulted with them, sort of semi-government agencies. So I supported the Secretary of the Air Force. It's called the Air Staff at the Pentagon. And then that was first 10 years. And then I went on to support what was called the Space and Missile Systems Center. It's called the Space Systems Center now in Los Angeles. And for the past 30 years, I've been in here, Albuquerque, New Mexico, supporting Air Force research labs. Now, this might be my 2nd lecture or discussion over the last few years. And I've lectured in 26 different countries around the world, different allied countries. And so I do the bigger picture. I think particularly the Space Force emphasizes the tactical aspects of space warfare. But space, by definition, is strategic. I mean, it covers the world. And if you take people, unfortunately, are used to war on the ground, blowing things up on the ground, but they're not used to that happening in space. So it's more politically sensitive. And if you start a space war and people find out about it, it has all kinds of political consequences. Also, I'm old enough to realize, and actually even the ancient Greeks realized this, that the whole point of war is not to blow things up and kill people and all, is to make the other side change their mind. So essentially, you're not fighting the war in the ground, the war in space. You're fighting the peace afterwards, geopolitical realignments that occur. So I don't think space people, Space Force, maybe even I think the UK has the Space Command now, truly understand that the global nature of space. For example, I was at a military exercise decades ago, and we were refighting a war in the Middle East, Desert Storm. And even during Desert Storm, they purposely took out Iraqi heavy Earth terminals communicating with satellites. I knew a Navy captain who was in charge of Schwarzkopf's staff, and he said, Schwarzkopf purposely put the French forces on the leftmost of the left hook to make them most vulnerable so that they would turn off the French spot imagery satellites so the Iraqis wouldn't see us doing the left hook. That's kind of space warfare in an economic sense. So, but nowadays, how do you deny an adversary the ability to image the battlefield? Well, you can use lasers on the ground maybe and things like that. But you might take out some ground stations in the country that's your enemy. But let's say going back to the Middle East, the adversary can download that information to a Earth terminal in Thailand and transmit it via submarine cables back to the Middle East. Now, are you going to blow up a satellite Earth terminal in Thailand? I doubt it. Are you going to cut the submarine cable? Maybe, but probably not. But you're already thinking global. It might be a local war, but when it comes to space, you take out a satellite or just mess with it, temporarily deny its ability to accomplish its mission. And then how does that influence what's happening on the ground? Because, the Space Force might think, this is wrong or something, but the whole point of the Space Force, at least in the United States, is to support the terrestrial battlefield. There's no colonies in space that, we're trying to defend and things like that. So you have to kind of link up with what they're doing and what the consequences are. So let's say at the end of your fiscal year in the military budget, you happen to have an extra $100 million to spend somewhere, and you could put that on a fancy new satellite weapon system, that just looks really cool, high tech, or you can re-equip an army brigade with better tanks or something. Now, it doesn't matter how fancy this or that is. What is the ultimate effect on the battlefield? Okay, the Army is pretty good, the United States Army, of doing operations research, simulations, and saying, oh, if we have these better tanks, the war will end 3 days earlier with 5% fewer casualties, something like that. Space generates information and transmits information. So you have this cool space weapon. You take out the adversary's ability to generate that information. How did that impact the battlefield? Gee, you're talking about simulating a human mind. Will he attack left versus right? If you had that information or was denied it or you spoofed it or something like that. So that's kind of hard to figure. Also, you're not attacking the satellite, you're attacking the mission. Let's say it's an imagery satellite. You're attacking its ability to image the battlefield. And ultimately, you're not attacking the mission, you're attacking the adversary commander's mind that is using that information. So maybe this really cool $100 million weapon system is really not so cool afterwards. Maybe it's going to violate treaties, international treaties. Maybe you should hold back some weapon systems so that if we destroyed everything in space, well, we won the war. Wait a minute. All your allies hate you now. All of these new treaties after the conflict denying your ability to do that next time around. And oh, by the way, you just trained your adversary how to fight you better next time around. So you have to play these kind of strategic mind games. And that's what I emphasize in. But quite frankly, the Space Force has no interest in that. So I'm just sort of blabbering away on a lot of these concepts.
Potential space threats. What are the main concerns nations should have for their space assets and services they deliver?
Well, first of all, I don't care what sort of second or third world country you have. The most popular technique, in the United States and I think other places for satellite warfare is cyber attacks because, there's no serial numbers on electrons. You could have what's called plausible deniability, a fancy word of saying lying about it. No one can prove you did it. But any country on Earth has smart hackers who can hack a satellite, which does happen a lot. You need some intelligence information and things like that. Any country probably has universities that can easily assemble high-powered lasers to at least blind satellites. I don't know if you could do enough to destroy them, though I'm told the French told me a few years ago when I was in Lyon briefing the French Air and Space Force that they have a mobile laser blinder that they can turn up the power and do some damage. This is all unclass discussions we're having. So those things exist. Now, I suppose the best way to think of what's going to happen next is, well, what's happening in Ukraine? I mean, that's very much a hot war. What's been happening? Well, there's been GPS jamming going on. A lot of the American missile systems that relied on GPS aren't as effective now if that local part of the tactical battlefield, the GPS is being jammed. There's certainly a lot of communications jamming and cyber attacks. I've heard 3 or 4 times statements from various people, part of the conflict in Ukraine, that Elon Musk's Starlink satellites is very effective on the battlefield. I mean, I don't care if it's ancient Greek warfare or futuristic space warfare, or whatever, knowledge of your adversary and of yourself and being able to understand the battlefield and communicate it is kind of prime. So maybe it's still an open question. What is better, imagery in the battlefield or communications? And at least the world I worked in, communications seemed to be prime, taking out satellite communications. So that has been occurring. I even believe that the Putin attacked Elon Musk's satellites and he backed down. I mean, there was a whole bunch of thousands of them mysteriously deorbiting. Even though they blamed solar flares, it wasn't particularly big solar flares. Everyone always has an excuse. I've been told that the Maxar satellites that do imagery for Ukraine have been blinded. And by the way, I think the company just changed its name last week or something like that. So those are current threats. That's what's been happening. And there's even a website online, an open website that shows all the cyber attacks against commercial satellites. Now, so that's something to be concerned. And this is a hot war. But to my knowledge, I don't think anyone's gone up and blown up a satellite and all this debris and stuff like that. Assuming any country on Earth, maybe most of the things you'd be concerned with is not exactly a hot war like in Ukraine, but somebody kind of messing with your systems. I mean, when I was in India 2 years ago, they were talking about their navigational satellite capabilities stopped working. In Thailand or the Southeast Asia, I heard that too. It seems to be a popular thing. As a matter of fact, in 2014, I could mathematically prove that the United States attacked Russian GLONASS satellites, their GPS. You can see every time a Russian GLONASS satellite went over central Australia, Pine Gap, it stopped working. And if there were several Russian GLONASS satellites in view of this Pine Gap system, they would sort of blink out in numerical order, GLONASS 1, 2, 3, and 4, like someone was checking them off a list. It wasn't a permanent attack. I don't know what they did, some sort of cyber attack, maybe on the atomic clock on board. I saw an interesting map. There was a gentleman in England, and he had a GLONASS satellite receiver at that time, and he was looking at it, and the receiver told him he was 20 miles out in the English Channel. In other words, completely worthless. But that was a temporary thing. People love the temporary. Countries love secrecy. I think a few years ago at the start of the Ukrainian conflict, in the open press, there was an article about how there was an incident, whatever an incident means, between a Russian and an American submarine in the Sea of Japan. You go to CIA headquarters in McLean, Virginia, and on the wall, there's all these stars of agents who died in the line of duty and all that. But I don't think any of those caused a war. And it's the same with space. You can get away with a lot in space, and they have. I can prove a lot of that's been going on in space without getting the general public all upset and, oh my gosh, we got to go to war now and stuff like that. So in some sense, in a Machiavellian sense, war in space provides additional rungs on a conflict escalation ladder where adversaries can show intent, resolve, will against each other without going around and killing people on the ground. And as long as people can get their MTV from satellite links and things like that, they're what we call, when I used to live in Maryland, fat, dumb, and happy. And they don't care. So there's a lot of ways that you can do escalation control, and space provides additional rungs on an escalation ladder. So that's kind of good. So getting to the biggest threat in space that I don't think people have realized, at least in the open, and that is FOBS, Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. This is something the Russians invented in the 1960s, where instead of shooting nuclear ICBMs north over, the North Pole to attack the United States, they would send it into a partial orbit and come south and, attack. Now, if you had, let's say, just some sort of dumb satellite or whatever, let's say you had 2 tons of concrete sitting there in orbit, and you just sort of pushed it out of orbit, and it comes screaming down to the Earth, that comes down at Mach 26. That's way beyond hypervelocity. It's 3 times hotter than the surface of the sun. And hypervelocity weapons, we've seen these used in Ukraine already. Surprisingly, the U.S. doesn't have it. The Chinese have these hypervelocity weapon system, probably got the technology from Russia. They've had it for a few years, and their stated intent was to take out American aircraft carriers, some sort of Taiwan-Chinese conflict. In 2021, it was announced that China tested hypervelocity winged weapons dropped from space that came down and hit targets in China as a test. Well, that was 4 years ago. It's probably operational now. Now, let me do a fantasy here. Of course, I wrote a book on it, but let's say one night China decides to use these hypervelocity weapons from space and take out all, I think it's 11 American aircraft carriers around the world. Something coming down, 2 tons of concrete or whatever, coming down at Mach 26, 3 times hotter than the surface of the sun, makes a 100-foot hole in the hull of the carrier, and it sinks in minutes, besides hitting the cold ocean and a huge steam explosion. The U.S. is a maritime power. It's not a land power. Suddenly, the U.S. is a second-rate country. It can't march 1 million men across the Atlantic Ocean and defend Europe or whatever. Suddenly, China controls all the seas, and all of the oil that's in the Middle East is worthless if you can't ship it out. So that is a threat, and it's probably operational. That could happen tonight. They could take out the White House tonight. There's no defense against something like that. And it kind of puts you back maybe 500 years. I mean, no one's ever been able to really control all the oceans. Even Britain couldn't do that. But from space, oh man, the high ground, real easy to do. So the only solution to that, we go back where sea power doesn't matter. We go back 500 years where only land power matters. Suddenly, I guess China rules the world. I can't claim that's their intent, but it's possible. And the only one who can solve that is 1.4 billion Indians. Just take 1% of that, tens of millions of soldiers. It'd have to be land battles or something like that. So I'm fantasizing on this, but it's 60s technology that the Chinese already demonstrated. So that's a big threat, and I'm not sure what to do about it, except really understand what's up there in space, guys, because you could really rebalance the power relationships on Earth because of it.
Government spending and strategic planning. Only a small number of nations will actively have a true sovereign space network, and others will have a more federated approach and even turn to utilising commercial systems. What's your take on options available, and how will economics play out in that?
Well, it seems like the Ukrainian conflict has really stimulated people to really understand space. And now there's been various space attacks during the Ukrainian conflict. And so I think there's been a slight redirection in the United States because of that. But, they always knew it was there. They've had issues with it over the years. But certainly Europe has awoken from what I've been reading. I'm not an expert of, the NATO and European Union and things like that. But just what the press has been saying, that their military in general, they have to kind of go on their own, under the Trump administration. And then particularly in space has become even more important. Out of the 16 books on space warfare I wrote or co-authored, I have one that talks about each country in Europe, all around the world, and what were their attitudes towards space warfare. And I was particularly maybe astounded that in Germany, they are all against, war in space and, maybe post-World War II trauma, I don't know. But it seems like just in the last 6 months or something, they've really changed their attitude. And they're all sorts of talking about, we've got to start developing and, this space capability and that. And of course, they're not going to be openly talking about space weapons, but I'm sure they're looking at that. I mean, when I was in France, 3 or 4 years ago, they openly told me about their mobile laser blinder system, that imagery satellites coming over, they can blind it or maybe even damage it. Everyone is doing these space to space. It's called rendezvous and proximity operations, RPO. And that's sort of a lower level, longer term intelligence collection. Yes, maybe you can put, space mines on it, but maybe you're just monitoring communication. The French complaining about the Russian inspector satellite getting too close to theirs. China talks about them. They had one with manipular arms that pulled one of their supposedly dead satellites out of orbit, out of geosynchronous orbit, and put it in graveyard orbit. I'm told the Britons are doing that too in terms of an inspection satellite. And I think the French told me that also. So that seems to be the in thing. Now, there are commercial entities that are doing that too, at least claiming. And, they might sort of a NASA civilian commercial attitude of, oh, we're going to be refueling satellites. We're going to be replacing spare parts and stuff like that. But at the same time, that implies you have getting up close and personal. You can kiss the satellite. You have manipulator arms. It doesn't take much to have a drill or something that cuts wires and stuff like that. In other words, commercial entities can do space warfare. Now, I don't know what that means, why they would do it, probably under, the control of some country. Though it just appears to me that any country on Earth has their own computer hackers, and you can hack satellites. There's a website that shows the hundreds of hacking attacks that have happened over the decades on satellites in space. So and the most popular thing, at least in the last 30 years, was cyber war against satellites. Now, I don't know with these manipulator ones, if they're getting a little more physical, let's say. But any country can do cyber warfare, even if there's some podunk country somewhere. It seems to me that you can also do laser blinding. I mean, a lot of universities have high-powered lasers. I have a 7.5 watt laser I got on Amazon that can set my furniture on fire across the room in a fraction of a second. You put that on a satellite, but let's say a couple 100 watts, make it space qualified and stuff like that. But even from the ground, now, of course, you need to know where your target satellite is. You need to be able to precisely point this laser. You need to get reflections back from the skin of the satellite to tell you, oh, yeah, I hit it. You need to know what wavelength of laser you need. I mean, we're not talking big technology things here. Even there's, I remember years ago, you could buy a satellite jammer online, I think from Russia or something. And so again, any country can have a jammer, a cyber weapon. And quite frankly, these don't have to be big satellite dishes. They can be on top of embassies around the world. If you really want to have a worldwide coverage, again, any country on Earth can do that. Who knows if you have it or not? Even if they knew you have it, they're not going to say anything offhand, politically, diplomatically. I've always thought, too, that there's one thing of attacking satellites. The other thing is, well, which satellites and why and when is the satellite coming over? And also, like any sort of warfare, whether you're talking about ancient Greek hoplite warfare or futuristic space warfare, situational awareness is everything. You've got to know about your targets, about your enemy. How is he using that satellite? Is it really a threat to you? What are the diplomatic consequences afterwards, or legal consequences? Maybe new space treaties would be established after you've done something bad. But you really got to know what's happening. Now, the United States has the largest space surveillance network in the world, so it kind of knows what's happening, but it's still very difficult. And there's at least 2, if not 3, commercial entities who have these optical trackers. Most of the time it's optical now because the radars don't go that far in space. So you're trying to track satellites, that the glint coming off the sun and hitting the Earth. And so they have these worldwide networks of, telescopes, optical telescopes. And I'm not even sure what the business case is. They must be making money. I mean, how many commercial entities need to know where their satellite is? Generally, they know where it is. It has a radio beacon coming out and stuff like that. So they must be providing that information to certain governments. Now, it seems to me, again, any government around the world, let's just take India. And let's say they really want to know what's happening in space. It seems to me you can just hire one of those companies to put this network around, again, maybe on the rooftops of embassies around the Indian embassies around the world where there's good weather, it's not too cloudy and stuff like that, and have a worldwide network of these trackers. There's, at least in the United States, but I think in Europe, amateur astronomers, they pull their money together and they get these automated telescopes, and they're like $20,000 to $30,000, and they put them up in the mountain somewhere or something like that. And then they all go online and track stars or whatever. Well, that's not too much money for any country to buy 10, 50 of those, I don't know, and have a network tracking all these things. Now, what's the value of that? Well, even if you don't have any space weapons in your pocket at the moment, or at least ones you'd admit, maybe it has a lot of diplomatic value to know that the United States and China are at war in space. We can just see tracking the satellites. It just seems to me that somehow would be worthwhile to know those sort of things. So we're using the commercial, at least in the United States, and I'm sure in Europe too. We're using them more and more in space. And I'm not exactly sure of that because it makes it a target. It's part of the kill chain. But it's sort of like, I'm not a lawyer or anything, but it's sort of like I think in World War II, where there's merchant marine, commercial ships, shipping munitions to Britain, and then getting sunk by German submarines. I don't know how that worked. Were they compensated for the lives lost and the ship sunk or whatever? And it's the same with, let's talk about Elon Musk's Starlink satellites. I think he has a whole subsidiary that does military stuff. So that implies a subset of his Starlink satellites are being used for military purposes, by the way, in Ukraine at the moment. And does that make it a legal target in space? Does it make it a legal target on the ground, a command and control center that's controlling those satellites too? It's almost traditional now that cyber attacks are kind of acceptable. Even if you're attacking on the ground, the electrons don't have serial numbers on them. You can't really tell who's doing it, even though people kind of know, but you can't prove it in a court of law. So we're getting this admixture of military, commercial, and I don't know if we've really had a conversation about that and how that really works. We've had mercenary contractors like in Iraq and I guess even Vietnam and stuff like that. And they don't have legal protections, I guess, and all that. It's just a complex thing of how the world works now. And that's beyond my pay grade to understand that. And it seems like, Europe is really pumping the billions of dollars into it. I mean, it just sounds like everyone's getting really serious.
Cyber defense and space and government systems, more depth?
The preferred way of attack is cyber attack, and there's cyber defense. But I was on an unclassified military exercise a few years ago, and they did cyber attacks against a fake satellite they built in the lab. And at one point during the exercise, the one side inserted what's called a digital twin that looked just like the satellite, and the opposing side kept attacking it all day without realizing they were doing nothing. So I just feel cyber's kind of cool and it helps, but it's almost like going back to World War II, doing psyops where you change road signs and you confuse the enemy, but it doesn't really win wars. And if you've got a very intelligent adversary, how do you know their cyber attack really worked? He's going to fake his death or something. You're not really sure what's happening. There's worry about the industrial chain when you're building a satellite and you're getting these chips and, I don't know, tens of millions of lines of code going in. How do you know there's not some sort of cyber code that was inserted in by the manufacturer or by somebody afterwards? And it's in the satellite for years and they just have to send some sort of signal and suddenly they have control of the satellite, or the satellite starts spinning out, or the satellite, I could conceive, starts maneuvering towards your other satellite. Could you insert a code in the thousands or just one of the thousands of Starlink satellites, and they're all connected, and then that mystery cyber code gets into every one of them and it tells them start crashing into each other? There's so many clever ways, and I'm not a cyber expert, but I know people can get very intelligent, particularly when they're about to die in a conflict. So what do you do about that? I think there's a certain degree of arrogance saying, oh, well, we checked the code and we did this, we did that. But again, humans are so clever. There's always a way. And the first step to defeat is overconfidence on that. So I'm not sure what you do about that. And it's almost the same of, some country can attack the electrical generation plants and, ruin the economy. And I'm sure they're trying hard not to do that or to defend against that. But I wouldn't bet my life on it, one way or the other. So that's the preferred means. And again, you get back to any country can do that in one sense. And do you really know who did it? We have this whole cyber command here in the United States, and I hear nothing about it. Are they going around defending? Are they going around attacking? It's all very secretive, I guess. Is it very effective? Do they defend 80% of the time, but 20% of the time they get through. Nothing's perfect. So that's just a big mystery. But, I might have mentioned it last time we talked. I do this thought experiment that if you're a soldier in the trenches in Ukraine and you hear the Russian tanks revving up first thing in the morning and come attack you. And this egghead scientist shows up in your trench and he has this black box with a big red button that says, well, this is a cyber weapon. And if you push that big red button, it'll attack those tanks and they'll stop working, And it, worked real well in the lab, but goodbye, I'm out of here. And so, the tanks come attack you and you push the button and the tanks, rev down and 30 seconds later reboot, rev up and come kill you all, So is that the kind of confidence you want in cyber warfare? If you're the guy right there about to die versus having an anti-tank round that leaves a more satisfying burning hole in the ground where the tank used to be, And in some sense, it's even worse in space because it's not like there's a flaming satellite up there with big hole in it and you can't really see what's happening. So you don't really have confidence in what's happening. And, I've heard at least 3 different reports getting back to Ukraine and Elon Musk Starlink satellites about how effective his communication satellites being used in Ukraine, that without it, they would be losing or whatever. So I don't know to what degree that's true, but it sounds very true. And that sounds like the Europeans and the Americans and probably everyone else watching understands that, gosh, if we don't have space, we're probably going to lose this ground battle. And so how exactly is the space battle going to come around and go forth? And what are the consequences? Oh, gee, who knows? We don't have thousands of years of experience like we do in terrestrial conflict. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And I don't know how you handle uncertainty, again, with the cyber defending, attacking. I know when Russia attacked Viasat's ground terminals, it was like the first or second day of the start of the war, the current conflict 4 years ago. It took out hundreds of electrically generating windmills in Europe. So that was a, unintended consequence, I guess. So if we do really a big cyber attack or we're just blowing the hell out of satellites in space, what exactly are the consequences? Now, if you're blowing things up, you've got debris and stuff like that. But maybe suddenly you're just doing cyber or laser or something. Suddenly your ATM cards don't work anymore. And, you can't get your cash and you can't transfer stock funds on the internet or something. And suddenly there's a whole stock market collapse. I mean, there's all these ancillary actions that might happen. Who knows? We don't have that kind of experience. And when you do, war is hell. Things are random. So you're certainly playing with fire with a lot of this because we're, unfortunately, we're very used on the ground to blowing things up and killing things. We more or less know the consequences, though even then it gets all screwy and your plans pre-conflict probably never really come to fruition post-conflict on that. So, yeah, the cyber thing, that's probably the fuzziest part of either terrestrial or space warfare. And I wouldn't put confidence in that. Now, I've thought of ideas like combined arms, like the Army talks about. And that is, well, maybe you do a cyber attack on a satellite or you do jamming. So it sort of fixes the satellite in space, so to speak, where the ground controllers can't put it into defensive mode or maneuver out of the way. And you keep attacking it for a few hours until you can get into position in an actual physical anti-satellite system that assures that you took it out. And so maybe that works pretty good. Now, the other thing about cyber warfare is I sort of touched on what's officially called plausible deniability. In other words, I didn't do it, but also it's reversible generally. You could probably do cyber attacks that actually damage something on a satellite, but you might do a cyber attack in the run-up to a conflict as a warning sign, escalation control. And many times, we're getting back to this civilian commercial use of space during conflicts. Well, maybe using this civilian satellite and the U.S. military is using it in Iraq or who knows where. But you also have, again, getting some banking system is using it too. So you don't want to take out the whole satellite, but you want some sort of precision taking out just certain channels.
Subscribe now to receive exclusive access to future Talk Satellite podcasts, featuring Paul and the voices shaping the space industry.